All right, looks like we have almost everyone here. So maybe we'll just get started. Is it okay to get started? Lisa, did you have any announcements you wanted to make, Lisa, Joel?
I'll do it at the end since she's on the mic.
Okay, sounds good. So hi, everyone. I'm Jen Watson. I'm one of the assistant division heads at Lincoln Laboratory in the ISR and Tactical Systems Division. And one of the things I love to do every summer is co-host this seminar series for BWSI Summer Institute. It's just a phenomenal program. We have some great speakers with fascinating topics, and I love to hear all your questions and your perspectives. So this is something I really like to do every year. Today we have Professor Muriel Medard. She is currently the NEC Professor of Software Science and Engineering in MIT's Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department. And she leads the Network Coding and Reliable Communications Group in the Research Lab for Electronics, which is one of the largest research labs in the department. She has many, many distinctive honors, and I'm going to name just a few of them today so you can get a sense of how impressive our speaker is. She was elected to both the National Academy of Engineering and is a member of the German National Academy of Science, Leopoldina, and she's a fellow of the IEEE, and that's a mark of a really outstanding researcher. She's won numerous awards, including the MIT Edgerton Achievement Award and the IEEE Communication Society Edwin Howard Armstrong Achievement Award, and numerous awards for both her mentoring initiatives and her service. She holds over 60 patents, and she co-founded Code On, and she has advised over 85 students and postdocs, and she holds 3 bachelor's degrees in electrical engineering and computer science, math and humanities, as well as an MS and SCD from MIT. So we're really fortunate to have her today. She's going to give a talk entitled Deviation from the Standard Toward Opening Up 5G Telecommunications. So I'm going to turn it over to her in just one second, but I encourage you all to put your questions in the chat. And as you think of them, I'm going to make notes and I'm going to call on you to ask your question yourself. So don't forget your question. Okay, this is just a great time. Really excited to be here. And Muriel, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Robert, Jennifer, everybody. I really love having this opportunity to chat with you guys. And, you know, I should also mention that I am a Lincoln Lab alumna. So that was my first job upon finishing my PhD was at Lincoln Lab. So today I'm going to tell you at a high level some of the really interesting, fun stuff that we've been doing. And the idea is both to introduce you to the technology side of this, but also to give you a little bit of an idea of the philosophy behind the choice of these particular topics and of the approach. And then I was asked by Robert to, you know, in the last 10-15 minutes, give a little bit more of let's say, reflections about career and maybe some advice in that context. And I'm hoping then to be able to take the last 10 minutes or so to do so. You know, many of you may be hearing about 5G. You know, many of you probably are too young to even remember 3G and when we went from 3G to 4G. But, you know, what you see really in networking in general is an evolution. And it's an evolution from a system where, you know, you went to some content server, some website, which was located somewhere along sort of a pretty linear path, to something where you have a lot of storage, a lot of data, you know, be it mirror sites or, you know, lots and lots of different caches all over, distributed in a geographically pretty varied way, to also a system that's including more and more, you know, diverse technologies. And in effect, it's becoming a much more complicated, you know, rich ecosystem, what we see currently. And one of the things that always becomes difficult is, how do you reconcile the sort of increasing heterogeneity, mixture of different technologies with the need to manage in some reasonable way the deployment of these technologies, right? So you see a lot more computing, a lot more what we call the cloud now. Really what we're seeing is a lot of virtualization, but underneath all of that, there has to be some way to have, different nodes, different elements in the system talk to each other. And the way that has generally been done is by having standardization, okay? And when people ask, for instance, what is 5G? Is it a technology? Of course, it's not a technology. It's actually a huge suite of technologies. Some of them are actually very old-fashioned, literally going back to the 60s with some of the schemes. Some of them are much newer. But generally, formally, it's a set of standards. You look at a body named 3GPP, which does a lot of the standardization. De facto, officially, it's international. It's the ITU, a different body that does it, but it's actually 3GPP. But we're talking formally about what we're looking for in 5G and that really rich ecosystem with, storage and computing and virtualization and completely seamless a type of experience. Really what we're looking at is something which is integrated across different technologies, which is reliable and which has low delay. And this integration across different technologies can be tricky. Even just a fairly cheap phone like this is going to have already a Wi-Fi connection. It has a 4G connection, say going around, say 2.5 gigahertz. That's the carrier frequencies out of the area of the frequencies of spectrum where it's operating. It's also going to have a Bluetooth connection. And, 5G phones may have even other types of connections, for instance, what we sometimes call millimeter waves, say going around 28 gigahertz, some systems going around 3.5 gigahertz. Some of you may have heard that whole controversy around was 5G interfering with navigation systems on planes. That was because there were things that were happening around 3 point something gigahertz. So you're having this increasingly rich system with more and more different types of technologies included in a single piece of equipment. How do you actually deal with this? And in particular, how do you deal with this with low delay? A lot of sort of the desires in current systems is to be able to have low delay, which is not the same thing as having a lot of throughput. Having a lot of throughput, the way I like to describe it is, I suppose that during the pandemic, you ended up getting, I don't know, like one of those, deliver at home meal services. Your throughput is, 52 boxes of food a year, right? That's your throughput. But, the delay is that you get those boxes on a weekly basis, not that you get, 52 boxes of not very fresh food at the end of the year. And if you get 150 boxes, that doesn't actually help you. You actually only need what you need, but you need it when you need it. Okay. So there's this desire right now for low latency. So, getting your boxes of food at the right time, but also ultra reliable, which means you really are getting your box every single week. You don't go a week without getting your box of food. And the way this is actually done right now is by adding coding. And I'll tell you in a little bit what coding is. There's also reliability transport protocols, such as, repeating the information when it didn't get there and so on. But the problem is that, these schemes for actually adding reliability tend to clash with the requirement or the desire to have things go fast. All right, so back to 1948, and Shannon, who was a professor at MIT, Basically, this was, after World War II. Shannon had actually worked on things like cryptography and trying to bring the Enigma machine, the kind of project that's often associated, and rightly so, with Turing. And he was thinking, so Shannon was thinking in terms of, how can I actually send information in a reliable way? Now, I'm communicating to you and I'm sending you data. Now, right now I'm sending you data oral, verbally. But, if I was communicating to you with numbers, with bits, with Boolean variables, I would send you strings of characters, maybe let's say a string of 8 characters. And suppose that I send you the 011100000 string, and you hear it wrong because there's, some sort of difficulty with Zoom. Maybe you hear the last bit to be a 1. Well, if that was a valid message, then you're just going to misinterpret what I said because you heard something different than what I said. And if what you hear is a valid message, that's it, we're doomed. So somehow it has to be that first you look at what you got and you said, that can't be right. That doesn't look like a valid message. And secondly, what would be nice is, rather than just repeating over and over again until you get it, would be if maybe there's some structure or, some mechanism for you to be able to look at what I said and go, oh, I think that what she meant was actually the original message. Now, one way to make no mistakes for sure is if I always told you the same thing. If there's only one message I ever sent you, then there would never be any mistake in our communication. On the other hand, it wouldn't be a very rich communication. So we need to have something where you're going to trade off the richness of the communication, which is how dense the code book is. That's to say, out of all the 2 to the 8 possibilities for my transmission, which of those 2 to the 8 are actually valid messages? The more are valid messages, the denser, the richer my communication is. We're going to have to trade that off versus your ability to make heads or tails of what you received in case of some errors. Okay, and this is what coding is made for. You basically I'm going to construct a code book, and we're going to tell you how you construct a code book, and you're going to decode. So I'm going to construct a message according to certain rules, and you're going to use those rules in order to try to infer what it is that I sent you. Okay. Now, going back to what we would like to do in these very complicated systems, I'd like to have low delay. Of course, I always want low complexity. I'd like flexibility, of course. I'd like to be able not just to send you 8 bits or 1,000 bits. I'd like to be very, very malleable with what I send you. I'd like to have a lot of flexibility in the design, in the delay. And of course, I'd like things to be robust to the realities of transmissions. Really what we've been doing up until now in coding is we haven't been low delay. We've long gone to large codes. We haven't been good about taking into account the realities of systems. And we have created a very, very complicated ecosystem of matched encoders and decoders. Now, let's go back to Shannon. And, what was it that he told us? How did he actually tell us to do all these really difficult things, to have read Mueller codes with majority logic, read Solomon codes with Burley-Massey decoders, low density parity check codes, again, invented at MIT, but belief propagation? No, he wasn't saying that at all. Remember, let's go back to our example with the 8 bits. He said, suppose that I have a length n string. Okay, so I have 2 to the n possible strings. In the example I just gave you, the n happened to be 8. Okay, so I'm going to make a code book, which is in effect a dictionary, a list of the possible messages. And this is how he said we're going to do it. He said you can make a code book whose rate is r, and the rate r is basically the fraction of the bits that is going to be actual transmission payload, actual information. So if I sent you 8 bits, and out of those 8 bits, only 6 bits are actually information. It means that I had 2 to the 6 possible code words, even though the length is going to be 8, and therefore the 2 to the 8 possible strings. Okay, so you're going to receive 2 to the 8 possible strings, but out of those 2 to the 8 possible strings, if there's only 6 bits of actual information, it's 2 to the 6 different messages that I'm sending to you. Okay, so 2 to the 8 over 2 to the 4, 2 to the 6 over 2 to the 8. Basically, what you're going to have is, really only 1/4 of the messages is going to be an actual valid message. Okay, so he wanted to see how big can I get my R? So in the example that I gave you, if it's 6 bits over 8 bits, the R would be 6 over 8, so it would be a rate 3/4. And he said the highest I can get is 1 minus something called the entropy, which is just a statistic of the noise, where the noise is the representation of the things that can go wrong in the channel. So remember, in our example here, what went wrong? This last 0 here got turned into a 1. We're going to call that bit flip the noise. Okay, so the noise here is the effect of having a bit flip. And this is what Shannon said you could do. He didn't say build all these complicated codes with all these decoders with lots of fancy names. He said the following. All right, you have, say an output of 8 bits. So you're going to make a bag with all 2 to the 8 possible strings in there. And then you're going to give me a rate 3/4. So you're going to have all the 2 to the 6 possible 6-bit messages, and you're going to put them on a shelf. And so I have my bag and I have my shelf. I'm going to take the first message of length 6 bits. I'm going to pick at random in the bag uniformly a length 8-bit message. I'm going to assign the first 6-bit message to the length 8-bit code word. I'm going to record it. I'm going to put back the length 8-bit code word in the bag, and then I'm going to take on the shelf the next length 6-bit message. Do the same thing again, over and over again. When I'm done with all my 2 to the 6 possible strings, remember I'm picking with replacement in this bag, which is pretty lazy, but that's okay. What am I going to end up? I'm going to end up with a ledger with all of these assignments, and I'm going to share the ledger with you. This is basically our agreed code book. This is our agreed dictionary. Now you're going to look at this ledger, and then I'm going to start talking to you. And when you get a length 8-bit string, you're going to look at that length 8-bit string, and you're going to look through this dictionary, through this ledger, and say, which of the messages, of the 2 to the 6 messages, looks the most like the length 8-bit string that I received. That's what you're going to do. Okay, so you basically, every time you get an 8-bit string, you're going to sort of look at it and go, what does it look like? Okay, so for instance, in the example here, you might say, oh, well, that looks pretty close. They're only off by 1 bit. Okay, and that's what he said you would do. That's called a maximum likelihood. Okay, so Shannon told us what to do, and he said if you do that, you can get to this high, to this highest rate with vanishing probability of making a mistake. Let's give you some idea. H is the probability. Actually, it's a statistic related to the probability of making an error. In typical terrestrial channels like the 5G that I talked about, the probability of a big flip is around 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4. H is of that order also, okay? So it means that the rate should be 0.999 something. I should be able to get very close to almost 100% efficiency in my transmission and still be very reliable. Okay, so why don't we do what Shannon said? Well, first of all, he didn't say use 8 bits like the example that I gave you. He said your N should be pretty large because you want some sort of concentration to average. Okay, let's say around 1,000 bits. And of course, you want your R, which is your efficiency of your transmission, to be large. I just told you, the H, that entropy of the noise is like, 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4. So the R should be, 0.9 and above. In that case, the number of possible messages, which is 2 to the NR, is going to be very high. So remember in the example that I gave you before, N was 8, R was 3/4, so 2 to the NR was actually 2 to the 6, but if NR is actually, 1,024 bits times 0.9, we're looking at 10 to the 277. All right, so 2 difficulties. Remember that ledger where I wrote down that random choice between what I picked in my bag of length 8-bit strings, which here would be length 1,024-bit strings, and my messages? Well, that ledger is going to be huge. So I can't really store that ledger. The second one is at the receiver. Remember, when you're looking at what you got and you look through the ledger to see which one looks the most like what you received, that's going to be a lot of computation for you to figure out which one looks the most like it. Okay, so those 2 difficulties have been why we don't do what Shannon told us to do in 1948. And instead we have, this evolution of codes. I gave you already some idea, but, you have these block codes in the 1950s, followed by convolutional codes, which are like block codes, but computed over polynomials rather than computed over just numbers. So-called modern codes, like low-density parent check codes that I mentioned before. I say so-called modern, they were rediscovered in the 90s, but actually they had been developed in the 60s. Bob Gallagher's thesis at MIT on low-density parent check codes was from the early 60s. Polar codes, which are also developed by an MIT alumnus, Erdal Arakan at Bilkent University in Turkey, which are now have been incorporated into the 5G standard. Okay. Now, let's go back to these 2 difficulties and the reason why, coding became this really, really intense, complicated, multifaceted system. Remember, there were 2 difficulties. The first one actually is not there. It hasn't been there since the 1970s. Bob Gallagher, the guy who discovered LDPCs, Erdal Arakan's thesis advisor, also my thesis advisor, had pointed out that if you just take those strings, remember, of length 1,000, multiply them by a random matrix, again, chosen uniformly at random over a finite field, so not binary because that's a little too small, but a somewhat larger field modulo something, let's say, then actually you end up with a code that's really good. And the nice thing is, instead of having to keep that ledger, remember, all you need to do is keep one matrix. Okay, so say that I was going from length 6 bits to length 8 bits, I would just have a 6x8 matrix, and that one matrix replaces that need to do this point-wise assignment from a message to a code word. Okay, so the encoding that assignment is easy, and my providing you the description of the assignment is also easy. I just need to send you a matrix. So the only thing that stays difficult is the second part, is the computation at the receiver. So because of that difficulty, what people have been doing is using high redundancy code, so low rate, and code-specific decoders. Okay, so and in order to make up for the fact that we're using low rate, so much lower R than that 0.999 that Shannon told us was possible, what we've been doing is we've been adding spectrum. Okay, so, you hear maybe about, the Federal Communications Commission doing spectrum license auctions, it's like tens of billions of dollars at the last auction. It turns out a huge chunk of that spectrum is actually wasted because the codes are low efficiency. So rather than being at 0.999 efficiency, they're running at rate 1/2, maybe 2/3. So you're basically throwing out tens of billions of dollars because of bad engineering. Okay. And what is that bad engineering? So remember, you have this corruption by noise, and it's not a lot of corruption. I told you it's like 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4, like, 0.1% of the bits are affected, but that's still too much relative to the needs for high reliability. If that's a message that is including some of your bank information, you definitely don't want it to be corrupted. It becomes very, very difficult to undo those issues. So you have different kinds of codes, Bose-Chaudhuri-Hockenheim codes. I mentioned Reed-Muller codes. I mentioned Polar codes. You also codes that are just there to check whether data is okay or not, just to check integrity, things like cyclic redundancy check codes. And you have these random linear codes that I told you, these RLCs that, Gallagher told us in the 1970s, you can argue maybe it was end of the 60s, are good enough for capacity achieving, but that basically were not being used because people didn't know how to decode them. And you have to go with that, basically a mountain of chips, okay, for these different encoders. Some of these codes don't have decoders at all, but each code needs to have its own chip for encoding, its own chip for decoding. Sometimes different rates for the same style of code need a different chip. Okay, and some of the recent work we've done using an approach that I'm going to describe to you in a minute, which is guessing random additive noise decoding, or GRAND, actually can decode all of these codes. See, this is that little rainbow. You can decode all of these codes with one chip, and you can see here a picture of this chip. Now, how am I going to do the decoding? Well, instead of having a scheme where I look at the output, which we generally call Y, so think of a vector of length, say 8 bits in my example, and I try to figure out what of the 2 to the 6, say 2 to the NR possible inputs I had. Here's a plus, let's say modulo, modulo 2, like an XOR with a noise where a noise of 1 means that I flip a bit because I'm XORing a 0 with a 1. It means a 0 goes to a 1. I'm XORing a 1 with a 1. It means it goes to a 0. If instead of looking at the X's, which is the natural desire, right? You're trying to figure out which X was sent. That's what you care about. If instead I look at the noise, okay? And remember I told you, 1,000 bits roughly is the typical length of a code, and this H, this entropy of the noise, this entropy of this basically highly flipped, highly biased coin flip, which gives you a 1 when there's a bit flip, and gives you a 0 if there's no bit flip, which is like 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4. The number of actually likely noise sequences is very small. It's exponential in n, but it goes as to the nh. So even if n's around 1,000, if h is around 10 to the minus 3, then nh is around 1. So this 2 to the nh, the number of possible, high likelihood noise patterns is actually very, very low. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to guess a noise pattern. Say the most likely one is that it was all zeros. That's to say there was no noise. The second most likely one might be one with a single bit flip, maybe a bit flip towards the end of the communication, because often that's when there's more bit flips, or maybe towards the beginning if there's something else that I know. Maybe have some information from the receiver. This is what we call soft information as to where that bit flip could have happened, because maybe my receive signal strength indicator is a little high or a little low, whatever it may be. So any information that I have about the likelihood of where an error may have occurred in my sequence of bits, I'm going to incorporate, and I'm going to guess from the most likely noise effect to less likely noise effects. And the first time that, after having subtracted that noise effect, I get an element of my code book. Okay, so remember that ledger, which at this point we said I don't really need a ledger. I just need a matrix. The first time I find something, yeah.
Can I just, there are a few questions in the chat asking for clarification on the operation symbols. Could you just, they're trying to follow the math, I think. Could you just explain?
Yeah, let me see the question. What did you say?
So the
little minus symbol here?
Minus, right.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the minus just means I'm inverting the effect of the noise. So Z is the vector of the noise. To say if it was all zeros, I'm inverting no effect. It means I do nothing. If it's all zeros and a single one, say in the last position, it means I'm just flipping the last bit and see if that works out. That's a good question. Great. Okay. So I'm sorry, I haven't been really looking at the chat. I'll talk later about quantum computing, Bob.
I think most of the questions you've answered along the way, they're jumping ahead of you a little bit.
Okay, perfect. Very
so
good.
I think they're following.
Fantastic. Very good. Very good. Yeah. So, rather than calling it, guessing random additive noise decoding, we could probably have called it guessing random invertible noise decoding, but grand sounds nice and grind, it doesn't sound so nice. So we went with grand rather than grind. But the idea here is the complexity is a function of the noise. And the only way that you're using the code book is just to check, it's just to have a code book membership test. So now this code book just becomes a hash. You basically just compute a hash and you say, hey, after inverting the effect of the noise, say flipping certain zeros to ones or certain ones to zeros, do I have something which is an element of the code book? If yes, fantastic, I'm all set. And if no, let me try then the next most likely noise effect. Very good. Okay. And basically, now the decoder doesn't care about the code book. You're not sort of staring at the Y, staring at the output and trying to figure out which of the inputs looks the most like that output. You don't stare at anything. You just guess noise effects, and then you just check whether your guess was correct or not. So here's the setup that we have, and basically, we can use any old codes. We can use classic codes such as Reed-Muller, Reed-Solomon. We can use these codes, which I mentioned, polar codes. So CRC aided polar codes. Remember I told you there's a CRC is for doing a check. You can also add CRCs to help in your decoding. These are part of the 5G new radio standard. 3GPP I mentioned to you is that entity, which is basically an entity made out of large industrial players. That's how those codes got defined. But you can also use a random linear code like Gallagher told us to do back in the 70s, which come in any length and any rate. Okay, most other codes only are available at certain lengths and only available at certain rates. And it turns out that if I have a random linear code, if I have a code length, say a limited code length, which remember I generally, even though, Shannon had told us, hey, go to 1,000 bits or more, we would actually like to have so much shorter codes. Because remember, we want that low latency, which is not compatible with having really long code words. Here are some nice results if you want to play with this on GitHub. This is one of my colleagues at MIT, Professor Polyansky, keeps a GitHub repository of a curated set of bounds. This is capacity. That's that 1 minus h I mentioned before. So here is, probably the bit flip is 10 to the minus 2 here. The block error rate, that's to say the probability that you messed up in decoding a message is, your target here is also 10 to the minus 2. Now, remember, if you had a code length of 100 and you have a bit flip of 1 in 100, roughly the probability that you would make a mistake would actually be about 1. It would be about the bit flip probability times the code length. Is called a union bound. Okay. So, it really means like every single message would be wrong if you have messages of length 100 bits if you didn't code, right? So, a good rule of thumb is you're trying to get the block error rate, the probability of a message being wrong, to be about the original bit flip probability. Okay, so you're trying to bring your probability of error down here by a factor of, 2 orders of magnitude relative to what it would be raw if I didn't code. So these are some bounds, never mind what they are. Let's just say they're theoretical. Normally people can't achieve them. This is an upper bound on the rate that you could have, which is always somewhat less than capacity, because to have capacity, you need the n to be like, thousands. And we are actually able to get these points, okay, which are better than the currently best known bounds by just using a random linear code and using grand. And when I mean by random, I actually mean random, the first thing picked out of a hat. Okay. Now, again, remember, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry built on making these codes over here. And what I'm telling you is you don't have to. You just don't have to. So you can decode existing codes that had already decoders. You can decode codes that had no decoders, like RLCs. Now, what does this mean? This is block error rate. We generally show the block error rate in a log scale. So, this is 10 to 1 speed, probably 1 of an error, not very good. Probably error 10%, 1%, 0.1%, etc. And then this here is just that bit flip probability for the bit error rate, BER. So that P that I showed you before. So this would be bit flip probability of 10 to the minus 3, bit flip probability of 10 to the minus 2, etc. Okay. So say that I want to be somewhere here, like 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 3. And these are, again, just different kinds of codes. And the dashed lines are the theory, and the full lines is the measurement coming out of the chip. All right. What happens here is that you can do much better. This is then the state of the art. Just gonna go fast over here. Just again, to show you, this is what communications look like. We call these waterfall curves. You see, it's sort of like you get high probability of error. And then as your system gets more signal to noise ratio, typically the probability of error goes down very dramatically. You can see this is the state of the art. EB over N0, EB is the energy per bit, which includes the energy that you have to basically pay for the redundancy. Remember, I had 6 bits of messages, but of actual payload, but 8 bits of transmission. That means that I have to pay in energy, not just for the 6 bits that I transmitted that had the information, but the extra 2 bits of redundancy that costs me in my energy. And N0 is a power spectral density, is a measure of how noisy my system is, okay, how much noise there is. So this is basically a cost, as I go to the right, it means that relative to my noise, I'm sending more and more energy, and therefore I get better and better performance. Okay.
Muriel, there are a couple of questions about RLC, and maybe I could have Harshil. Could you
of course
ask some questions just to help clarify?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just asking, like, RLC existed far before Grand was invented. So then what was its use before Grand if it had no decoder?
You couldn't, none.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question that you couldn't decode it. You know, you could write proofs with it. It was really used as a proof technique, you know, existence proof, but not actually as a practical engineering tool. So it's a really good good question. Very, very good question. Remember how I told you about, you know, how well you know, do we match to what's going on basically in systems? You know, I told you about bit flips and so on. You know, noise is really messy. This is a measurement not done by us of bit positions in a frame, okay, a transmitted set of bits. And you can see here's the frequency of errors, right? I mean, it's still like, you know, this is like 1%, you know, you're still much lower than 1%, usually around like, again, 10 to the -3, but you can see that it's really, really messy how these errors occur. So what people do is they actually take the bits and they munge them. It's called interleaving. They mix them around to make the errors look independent. But actually, if you knew that the errors were dependent, if you knew that they tend to be clumped like they are here, you might actually be able to do a much better job in guessing the errors that occurred, because you know that they actually might be clumped. And that's exactly what you can see here. So if you use GRAND and you use the fact that you know that the errors are clumped, it's what we call the Markov model. That's to say a model that has some memory. That's to say, if I've recently had errors, it's more likely that I have errors. If I recently haven't had errors, it's more likely I'm not going to have errors. So you have this sort of clumped model. It's actually giving you, it's as though I was giving you more energy. So the kinds of things that people usually in current systems right now, because of these constraints with structured codes and their associated decoders, they have to mix everything, which by the way is giving you like a ton of extra delay, like literally a factor of hundreds more delay. Okay, which remember gets paid for by having more frequency, by trying to go faster. Remember, do stupid things faster by getting more spectrum. So literally you could save yourself, you know, 99% of the money right now if instead of doing this interleaving, you actually just did things correctly. Okay. And use the information. So in general, as an engineer, you know, if you have some statistical knowledge and you find yourself going, oh, I'm going to interleave, I'm going to mix it, I'm going to forget about the statistical knowledge, stop and think, do I really have to do that? Do I really want to lose information about my system? Okay. So basically, you know, it's like you're losing a power factor of 4. It's like you had a 4 times more powerful transmission if you kept the information about this correlation, the structure, this lumpiness. Okay. So what I'd like to convince you with this is I really hope that you think in the future about not just looking at the math that people have done and then make the engineering look like the math, you know, with like these long codes and going to the average, but try to look at the engineering need and then be sufficiently bold about your math to make the math look like the engineering. Okay. Basically, that's really what we did here. Okay, we really made the math look like the engineering, and we said, you know, never mind going to this n being long, never mind staring at the y to try to figure out the x. I'm going to solve the easy problem. I have a problem here which has a small dimension. That's the one I'm going to tackle. With that, I'd like to take some questions about this, and then if there's any questions, I'll answer them, and otherwise I'll go to, you know, some sort of reflections about career path. I have some questions here. I can see, how can you predict channel burstiness? Yeah, so, you usually have some measure of this channel burstiness. And what you're doing is, what we're doing here is we're just saying, hey, look, if I know that if there's going to be errors, I'm going to guess them more in a clumped way rather than in a non-clumped way. Does that make sense? I'm more likely to have errors that are, rather than having like one error here, one error there, another one error, if I'm going to have errors, they're going to be more likely to be together. Did I answer that question? Okay, great. How accurate is grand? Yeah, a grand is maximum likelihood. So it is optimum. And we have implemented grand with the chip I showed you. This is work with my collaborator Ken Duffy, the Hamilton Institute in Ireland. And the chip was done with the group of Professor Rabia Zichdel at BU. How much of this field is stats probability? How much is implementation? So the original idea definitely came from the math, okay? But if you can't implement it, it's not engineering, okay? So it's really, really important, that you feel that you can go from the math to the implementation, because the proof is in the pudding. But if you did the math right, then the implementation should be doable. What are the encoding decoding methods now used in 5G? Is it grand? The answers, the encoding decoding methods are still the legacy ones. Remember the doing stupid things? That one. With a lot of bandwidth and a lot of energy. Yes. Okay. All right. Super. I'm getting about 10%. All right. That's my fault. Okay, good. All right. It's not an easy topic to follow. No. But I have a headache. That's okay. That's okay. All right. Okay. Well, I hope you can rewatch it. And, if anybody has questions afterwards, absolutely reach out to me. I'm going to put in my email there. Okay, great. Any other questions?
Muriel, they might like to hear the next part of your talk, a few reflections.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So, I don't usually give talks about reflections, but I was asked to do this recently. I was talking in Purdue for the Gilbreth lecture. Gilbreth was the first woman member of the National Academy of Engineering. And actually, some years ago, I had been named a Gilbreth lecturer by the NAE. And it was at that point that, I started looking at her life, which was very interesting. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of, personal reflections. And so okay. Question in the chat. Does anybody know who the dude with the wig is? If anybody knows, I will take you out for coffee, personally.
Guesses, any guesses?
French guy. All right. That was, yeah. All right. An old white guy. Yeah. Really old. Napoleon, Pascal, George Washington, Euclid, Francis Bacon, Louis. Plot twist. It's fake and created by, no, quite. Okay. It's Marivaux. But Pascal was a very good guess because I am a huge Pascal Joe Biden, I like that. Okay. Descartes was also a good way. Pierre Carlet. Yes, no, this guy's a little after Descartes and after he's closer to Voltaire in times than any other. Okay, Marivaux, and he wrote rom-coms. Okay, so this is an old white guy who wrote rom-coms. And one of his best known ones is Le Jeu de l'amour et du hasard, the game of love and chance. Okay. And, the main points from this is, what you thought was familiar might not be true. So there's a lot of people pretending they're somebody else, throwing in a lot of randomness, even if it looks really risky. And then at the end, whatever you thought the game was, you're actually trying to solve a different game. All right. So, standard rom-com stuff before, he basically, a lot of the things that you think are like their standard rom-com things, is really Marivaux who made it up. So what's the received wisdom? Okay. The received wisdom is you should specialize, you should have a focus on a specific problem. You should go through a carefully curated string of prestigious internships and jobs, such as the one that you're doing. You can tell winners early on. They're like the golden young person, it used to be called the golden boy, but let's just say the golden young person. You should be delaying family to focus on your career, and you should pursue an academic path. And, looking back on my career, boy, was that not what I did. So as I mentioned, I majored in engineering, math and humanities. Engineering was a total afterthought. I took a class in electrical engineering and I liked it. I didn't do the prestigious summer internships. My summer jobs was teaching aerobics in Texas, and also I got a job teaching aerobics in an Air Force base, working at gyms, while everybody else was at Lincoln Lab or Bell Labs or whatever. I didn't develop an aptitude in math until I was in my teens. I mean, literally, I sucked until I got to be about 14. 5 years later, I was married and I had a bunch of kids. You can see them here. Even though I am an academic and I'm a professor, I definitely always worked very closely with industry. And actually remember the question that people had as like, is this implemented? If it's not implementable, it's not engineering. Okay, it's just not. It's something, it's not. Okay. And so Lillian Gilbreth was very interested to find out about her life. So she actually majored in humanities. She interrupted her career. She had a very late academic career start at Purdue. She had a dozen kids. She provided a dozen. It's actually about her. And she worked as a practicing engineer for many, many years before joining academia. So, let's look at the game of the network and chance. So the first thing is what we thought may be familiar, may not be, it's not everybody has the same path. Throwing some randomness in there, a lot of what I told you today was about, grant, because this is my most recent work. A lot of really, what got me into the National Academy of Engineering and, all these, whatever, doctorates, honoris causa and fellow and blah, 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 is actually about doing constructions randomly. I mentioned to you random linear codes. Doing this at the network level, random linear network coding has been a big, what is probably one of the most successful items in my career. So doing things randomly, just like you saw the random linear codes do really well. Solving different games. I showed you Grant, which instead of trying to build codes and build decoders for those codes, I say, who cares about the code? I'm just going to build a decoder. It's going to be the best decoder because it's mathematically optimum. And I'm going to ask a completely different question. So I think that one of the things I really wanted, in terms of thought areas is, take reasonable risks, and, whether you're, maybe somebody with an unusual background, or whether you will be somebody who's going to have to judge other people, take into account unusual backgrounds. Just look at how well people have done in the past, put a lot of emphasis on just diligence, resourcefulness, being smart, being original, perseverance, and use metrics. Use metrics. Don't trust what people necessarily told you this is the way it is. Go out, make up your own mind, and then measure it and see what you get. And those are my thoughts. And with that, I'd like to see if there's any questions on this part and conclude.
We do want to be respectful of your time. I know you have another commitment. Maybe we could invite the two students, Alina Chen and Nev Gupta, to just add their final thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it,
Zenji?
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, I thought it was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot, especially because we take a lot of these things for granted, but the research behind it is really deep, and I thought it was a really interesting presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Alina. And
Yep.
Yeah, I also found it very interesting. It was kind of hard to follow for me, but it was definitely, I definitely enjoyed this presentation, and it was really interesting to see. Also wearing the t-shirt right now.
yay.
Muriel, can you on-share the screen so we can take a quick picture? We gotta edit it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Great.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Muriel.
Thank you,
much.
guys. Thank you.